Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be diving into probably a little bit of a hot topic, or you've heard the buzz around it here probably throughout the year, and that is the New World screwworm flies. But before we dive into that conversation, I do want to start up top by saying a thank you to our current sponsor of the Dairy Signal, which is Zinpro. And for over 50 years, Zinpro has been a leader in the research and development of performance trace minerals, and they believe that your herd's profitability depends on providing the right nutrition at the right time. So to discover their industry-leading tools and solutions, head over to Zimpro.com. And a huge thank you to them for their current partnership on the Dairy Signal. But I know why you are here today, and it's because we are talking about this interesting and maybe a little bit unnerving topic this afternoon, and that is the New World screwworm. And joining us today, we have Dr. Keith Poulsen, who is the director of the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostics Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. So, Dr. Poulsen, thank you for joining us once again here. I know it's been a little bit since we had you on, but this is a topic of importance that people should probably know a little bit about going into not only this end of the year, but going into next year especially. But before we get into that, would you mind giving those who might be meeting you for the first time a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Sure. And it feels like just yesterday when we were talking about something else or something else moving in the PDP realm with everything going on and all the development in the industry. But so my name is Keith. I'm a large animal veterinarian, and I practice at the School of Veterinary Medicine. Not quite as much now because I'm in the lab a lot. Most of what we focus on here in the diagnostic lab is infectious disease testing and then management of epidemic outbreaks like H5N1, and whether that's poultry in Wisconsin or we're helping with the dairy issue in the Southwest. A big component of what we do is making sure we have a strong and vibrant business continuity for animal agriculture, including and really focusing on our bovine germplasm export, so semen and embryos. And right now, as you can imagine, we are running at 100% for our CWD testing to make sure that we have rapid turnaround for our bow and then gun hunters starting this weekend. So there's a lot going on. I live in Lodi. My wife and I own a small animal practice. By me, I mean I'm the silent partner, and we have 3 kids.
Well, Dr. Polson, it's great to have you on. And I have to say, yes, it sounds like you are running rampant with the busyness here. So I appreciate you taking the time here this afternoon, especially going into a topic that I feel like has gotten a lot of buzz and media attention, but maybe not the full story, or there's always pieces and parts of it. So we're going to really dive into the New World screwworm here. But I think it's important that when we do so, we really set the stage because this is something that we've dealt with before here in the agriculture sector. So why don't you give us a brief background on what exactly happened and last time, I should say, or when it happened last time, and kind of get us caught up to speed, if you will.
Sure. So the New World screwworm, really the worm is actually the larva of a fly. And you think, why do we care about flies? Flies are everywhere. They come and they go. With after a hard frost, you see just a few flies left in your house, and in the milk house. But the New World screwworm fly is a little bit different. So we typically think of our regular horn flies, is that you'll see when they lay their eggs and larvae, and we consider them maggots, right? We see maggots all the time, whether it's in manure or dead animals, but they're laying their eggs in dead tissue. So whether it's like a necrotic wound on an animal, or in manure or dead animal, we'll see maggots in there, and those are those fly larvae as they come out and they pupate and then they turn into flies and do their fly thing. Well, New World screwworm, this particular fly is different because it lays eggs in live animals. And those eggs and the larvae will burrow into live tissue, which is pretty unique, and it causes pretty severe tissue damage. So the United States eradicated this New World screwworm in 1960. So we were dealing with it for decades, and we were able to then push the fly out of North America and then all the way into South America with a really interesting technique. And what they did is we built these big gamma irradiation facilities. So essentially, we microwave these flies. And flies, I'm not an entomologist, but when flies mate, they mate once and then that's it. So what they did is they gamma irradiated male flies, and then they dropped the male flies by the hundreds of millions per day. They would drop the male flies that would mate with the females, and because they were sterile, then those females wouldn't lay fertile eggs. So that's how they kind of killed the population and then drove them back down into South America. That took decades. And it was really because of the beef industry was a really big player. And we did see these flies in Wisconsin because they would make their way up, but then it really wasn't as big of a deal as it was in the Texas cattle populations because it's warmer there. They don't have that hard frost. So when we look at it now, is it coming back? And we're seeing it move back through South America into Mexico. It becomes a really big deal for not only the cattle population because we'll see like, well, is it going to, if we're not moving cattle, where else is it going to come in? It doesn't really selectively say I'm only going to go to that Longhorn or that Holstein. It's really any live warm-blooded animal, and then some birds, which is interesting. And the most likely way we'll see this come in would probably be on a person. We had a human case in June in Maryland from someone that was traveling in an endemic area and came up. It was news just because it wasn't reported right away, which is the news part is public health is working. They found it, they're treating it, no, not an issue. So that's really 1960 is when the last time we saw this.
And so it's been a minute since it's really had been an issue here within the US, but why is it coming back now? What kind of spurred this?
Yeah, so we did see this in the Florida Keys, which is kind of another interesting story. We saw it in the Florida Keys about 10 years ago, 10 years plus. And they were pretty sure it came in either on an animal that swam from Cuba, which could have been a deer, pig. I mean, they're great swimmers, or it came in on a dog or a person, and it affected the key deer. So the key deer are like miniature whitetail deer, right? They're cute little fuzzy monsters, and they're almost like the Florida Keys, their mascot, their beloved, almost semi-domesticated deer. And they started seeing this in these deer they're endangered. So they really clamped down on looking at all animals coming in, inspection for everything. And then they were able to eradicate it just by taking severe or heightened awareness. They treated some of the deer as well, dropped sterile flies. Well, that's kind of a little microcosm. It really did increase our awareness, like, ugh, this is getting really close to U.S. shores. And then we were monitoring these flies kind of moving back north up through Panama, because that's where most of our sterile fly production is or has been for the past few decades. And it was the most logical place to keep dumping it because there's a bottleneck there, right? Geographically. Well, budgets being budgets and geopolitics being geopolitics, those facilities were not maintained to the level that we needed. That was one reason. And it was kind of one of those things where you got to fight the most important problems. And then the second part is that the genetic evolution of the flies, they started to really not care. Those gamma radiated male flies weren't nearly as attractive as wild type flies or just the normal flies. I'm not really sure what goes into fly beauty or natural attraction, but they do know that they are needing to select new fly populations and making sure that they are just as attractive for the females to mate with. So there's a couple of different reasons there. But after we started getting through the Panama Canal, and we've had some issues with, funding and or quality control and other sterile fly population or facilities in Mexico as well. And then there's been some trade issues and border problems. And that's really where the flies continued then to move north. And then when you get into Mexico, obviously it's a much greater geographic distribution. And now, this year in 2025, we've seen flies kind of march their way toward north. And the closest flies that have been reported have been 70 miles away was earlier this summer, and then 130 miles away from the Texas border. I think that was just 6 weeks ago.
So it leads to then the question of, well, it sounds like it's almost inevitable that it's going to cross over the border because, such is life.
Mhm.
What happens then? What does that mean for those animals specifically in that Southwest region where it's going to hit first, and those producers as well?
Yeah. So talking to the veterinarians and the producers on the front lines to really kind of get the true lay of the land, what they're seeing, what they're expecting. They are expecting it to come because all of our countermeasures we're ramping up, and it's not a overnight thing. Where they're looking, and there are a lot of public education. The border's closed to cattle right now, and if it opens in very specific spots, that changes on a regular basis. So there may be one port open, but they are scrutinizing any animals coming in if they come in. And then public education, what are we looking for? We're looking for animals with obvious open sores, or their head shaking, or they're uncomfortable, or they might stink because abscesses stink, right? And that's with the amount of animals that move through our those Southwest states. We want to make sure that we're not moving it elsewhere. And the real economic burden here is that it would cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, to the beef industry alone, because it's going to create either condemnation on carcasses. Animals will unfortunately die. It doesn't have a super high mortality, but those animals do get pretty sick. And or you're trimming a lot of that out in the slaughterhouse. So they're looking for clinical signs with heightened awareness, and it's what we call active observational surveillance. It's what our herdsmen all over in dairy across the country and in Wisconsin, they're doing every single day. They just have a much heightened awareness, looking for very particular things. And then if there were to be detections, it would change potentially how we control animal movement, whether it's quarantine. We don't really know exactly what that would look like yet. We haven't heard that from our state animal health officials, but it certainly would be something that we would be talking about for raised awareness.
So that brings up a really good point when we're talking about, especially more on the beef side, in terms of carcasses maybe being condemned or having to have a lot of, that meat be taken out or, discarded in that certain way. And that gets me to thinking then, okay, we've talked a little bit about, it happens in live animals. They go into the tissue, but what exactly besides burrowing into, live tissue does this do to the animal? What are some of those signs? What does it do? How does it end for said live animal?
Yeah, so typically they're irritated because they're painful. So when those eggs go in and the larvae pupate, it creates an abscess. So abscesses are painful. And then abscesses can also call what we call sepsis, or generalized infection. So then they could get really sick and they could just be found dead. And then when you see those wounds out there, as the flies and the flies multiply, then you're going to start seeing more flies in other live tissue. So you'll see sick animals with hide disruptions because you'll see the abscesses. Anyone can Google those pictures, or they might be found in the processing and slaughter facilities. When we think about it, well, is this just a Texas problem? I mean, should we just focus resources in Texas? That's where I think the most of our control will be, mainly because Texas doesn't have a hard frost. But when we think about, well, what about the North, right? What about dairies in Idaho or Colorado or Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York? We move quite a few animals back and forth from that southwestern area. In Wisconsin and Texas alone is 6,000 animals per month move back and forth. Because just like today, it's kind of rainy and cruddy in Wisconsin, not great weather to be raising baby calves. So we send them south. And then what is that risk for a dairy up in Wisconsin that will bring animals back in. And I would say it's not zero, but it's not as quite as high as the south. That we could see flies up here. And really the advice for those farms that are bringing animals back in is make sure you're looking at them and there's very good active observational surveillance. And if you see anything, say something, because we certainly want to know more about it and then provide treatment recommendations or preventative or what we call metaphylactic treatment. If we see flies, we're going to treat other animals with insecticides. The great part is we're getting into December, January, February, where we really shouldn't be seeing flies anyway. So this is probably more of a watch this very closely through the winter for Wisconsin or the northern states. And then depending on what the situation is in the spring, then maybe we could start thinking about are there active measures we should be taking.
So I want to get back to transportation and treatment in just a second here, but
Mhm.
I want to ask, one more question on, these observational signs that we're looking for. When we're talking abscess, are we talking something that's, a quarter size, a baseball size? Where in the range of size wise do these typically get? Because sometimes we all know animals they find a way to get a little bit hurt here and there,
Mhm.
and you want to do the best to treat them appropriately. But where in this kind of range are we thinking for these symptoms, if you will?
Well, abscesses can be super variable, and we see them in cows all the time. They can be very, very impressively large, even if it's just a small, let's say maybe an injury that implanted a rock or some foreign body. But they'll start small. And most of the pictures that you see on you just Google images, you'll see small chains of abscesses that are, we try not to talk about them as fruit, but that's what most people will recognize that we're looking at blueberry size up to golf ball size, but you'll see more than one. You don't see just one, you'll see chains of them or animals that will have flies where they have a hard time brushing the flies away is in their axilla or maybe in their udder cleft or along their neck. And you'll see smaller abscesses. Obviously, the longer that they're there, they'll get bigger and then they'll rupture. Anyone who has sheep or goats and you've had problems with caseous lymphadenitis or from a Corynebacterium infection, they'll get lymph node chain abscesses and it looks kind of similar to that. Or horses with pigeon fever. Granted, we don't see pigeon fever in Wisconsin, but they do out west. So yeah, they can be variable. Obviously, the longer that they're there, cows are so good at laying down fibrin and making abscesses to kind of wall things off, is that they can get pretty large pretty quickly.
Well, thank you for going down that a little bit more, just because, like I said, everybody's seen an abscess and had one
Yeah.
too many experiences, it feels like, but trying to differentiate what's different about them. And then
When you
going
see
in.
a larvae climbing out of it or maggots, that's a real telltale response. And so I guess I'm glad you asked this too. If two, the flies do look different than just a regular horn fly. They have pretty large heads. They have a metallic kind of green body and they have some stripes on the abdomen. Now, it's really hard to say, well, is that one of those flies? And then really what's the answer to that? Grab a couple, put them in a blood tube, just a red top tube, or even a milk collection vial, probably easier, and send them, give them to your veterinarian, and we'll identify them for free. The network is activated, and we're all trained on what to look for. So just send some flies in if you're concerned that that fly does not look right. So sorry I interrupted you, but I think that's all good information too.
I was just gonna say I'd rather have you interrupt me on that because that is important information to know. But when we're thinking then, okay, so say, you are in the south or southwest, or maybe you had an animal that got brought back up from that region that does have something that looks to be in worst case scenario, what is the treatment for these animals?
So, treatment of the individual abscess is just like really anything else, right? The solution to pollution is dilution. So we open the abscesses, flush them out. If the animal's systemically ill, they may need antimicrobial therapy. If it's a group of animals coming in, let's say you're bringing in a truckload of 30 animals, putting them into a quarantine facility or something outside of because hopefully coming into Wisconsin, they're probably springers and they don't need to be in the lactating population. But I would have an isolation area. Let's say we're having an active outbreak in Texas, in especially with the areas where those animals are. They're probably going to be required to be under quarantine or treated with a topical insecticide before they come up, and then they'll be monitored quite closely in some sort of a quarantine facility on the farm. That's really hard to do, quarantine facilities on the modern dairy, unless they're built specifically to do that. So we have the individual animal treatment, which hopefully we don't see. But if we do have a suspect, that animal will be treated, and then probably the other animals in their group would be treated with some sort of a pour-on insecticide, depending on what FDA allows us to use. I know there's some emergency use labels coming in, and what our state veterinarian will prescribe, or what kind of regulations. And a lot of that is enforced by the state animal health official, which in Wisconsin would be Dr. Darlene Conkle and her team, and Dr. Elizabeth Patton, our assistant state veterinarian. So it's kind of up in the air about what specifically to do. We have lots of different options. Talking to some of my colleagues in Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, that they deal with this on a regular basis, because the flies are endemic. There's lots of different topical insecticides that they use. The flies have adapted, just like any other topical parasite, in those countries. So there are things on label, and then there's a lot of off-label use. So we just need to be careful to make sure we avoid residue issues for food-producing animals. So I think there's a lot of questions on specifically what can we use, and we're watching it very closely, and then we'll have to work in conjunction with Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection in Wisconsin, to understand what do we do if we see a positive.
So I'm probably working a little bit backwards here in the case, but I mean that brings up a really good question, especially if you are a producer who sends calves out west or southwest here, and you're thinking, well, I've got a little bit of time to maybe come up with a game plan, because almost inevitably it's going to come across to the US. There's probably going to be some places that are impacted a little bit more than others, and you would hate to be that person who has an animal or has some animals that you're trying to get back up here, and you're thinking, well, shoot, I don't know what to do. So since we have a little bit, I don't want to say the luxury of time,
Mhm.
but being that, it's not here today, and that, we're trying to think about making game plans. If you were a producer in this situation, what are some of the things that you would be thinking of now or putting in place in terms of, mm, I don't want to say catch-alls, but safety measures?
Mhm.
I know you were talking about, quarantining when they get back up, but anything they can do in those regions before bringing those animals up, that could also help.
Yeah, I think assuming that let's say there are no new treatments or new, because there's even companies out there that are developing vaccines for ectoparasites, which is really interesting technology. But let's say we're kind of status quo what we have now. I think if I had time and thinking, I certainly talk to my veterinarian when you're out doing herd check or you're reviewing protocols, dairy comp records, whatever it is. Talk to your veterinarian about what kind of biosecurity do I need, in case there's an issue and I can bring in animals. What do I do? Like what should we really look for? And I would be looking at what options do we have for housing, right? Do we have an ability to quarantine on the farm? Or is there a dairy farm that maybe isn't milking anymore, that, there's space that we could potentially rent and use as a quarantine space? And then working with, our herd veterinarian about, okay, so they're going to go to quarantine for X amount of days. Maybe we need to bring them up earlier. And then how do we introduce them to our population, and what are we going to do there? That's something we certainly can do right now. And it would be best practice anyway. It's quite challenging to do, right? Because it takes space. The bank doesn't like putting up buildings that don't make money, and cows that just kind of stand there and eat hay don't make money until they calve, right? So that's kind of status quo. The next thing, so talk to your vet, think about alternatives. I think what we would then also need to do is USDA has a 5-point plan that anyone can read, and they have a lot of ideas. They're ramping up different screw fly radiation plants in U.S., Canada, and I'm just Canada, Mexico, and Panama. But there also could be new treatments out there. There could be um, emergency use authorization from the FDA to allow topical or injectable. Uh, I'm trying to think of what the word is, not anthelmintic, but I guess insecticide preventatives, pesticides. That's the word I'm looking for. Or there could be something totally novel, like a vaccine that looks at um, the antigens that the larvae produce. So how do we know about that? Well, keep your eyes and ears open, and look for communications from our animal health staff in the states and USDA. It's taking a lot of press, so you're going to hear it. It's not going to be a secret, especially considering our Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, is from Texas. I mean, she's definitely taking this to heart. That's her. She's really putting a lot of resources into it. It just depends on what we'll have available, really, at the time. So we can do things now, and then we can wait and see what's new or what will be available if and when it becomes a larger problem.
So we've really talked about, how it's kind of come back to be, some of those issues that could happen if, you have animals within that western, southern region, especially if it comes across, which it may do. I'm not going to say it will because we like to be optimistic, but we're also realistic. Um, but and then you mentioned with the USDA, they have this 5-point plan. So
Mhm.
what exactly, I know you mentioned within Panama, Mexico, and as well as the US, that they're doing some work in terms of facilities. What does that look like? I know anything else that, is kind of that news or buzzworthy in terms of thinking about, well, there is some action being taken, but also how long until we start seeing some of this action actually coming about and making a difference.
So on the gamma irradiated fly front, tongue in cheek, I use, well, we just microwave the flies. It's a little more complicated than that. And I'm not a physicist, so I don't know how to irradiate a fly. But, you know, we're investing into fly production facilities in Texas. Those are supposed to be done by late 2025, which we're there, or early 2026. Nothing really goes on time when you're talking about a government entity, but that will be quick. And then investing, I think they said $21 million. That's a pretty small chunk of money, but in the grand scheme of things, $21 million for um, building new facilities in Mexico. That's going to be like an 18-month run, right? So we're looking at 2026, 2027, and then ramping up the current population of flies that are able to be produced in Panama, which is about 100 million per day. Now, that's just gamma radiation. In that, so you think, well, why don't we just continue to make more and more and more in Panama? Well, the interesting part about these flies is that you can't just put them in a box and then put them on a plane to Texas. They really only live about 2 hours in these boxes, so they're actually quite fragile. And then being able to select new strains of flies that are more consistent and compatible for mating, like what we talked about. So we really need to bring the facilities online closer to where the front of the flies are, which would be in Mexico, just because of logistics and making sure we have flies that are able to mate. It's really not just about building things. As you know, when you have multiple countries involved, and geopolitics being that, it's always confusing, is that really need to remove some of the bureaucratic barriers, whether that's in the U.S. or diplomatic relations with Mexico or Panama, and those have been kind of strained lately. But we're working on it, and I fully anticipate trade missions. I know Colorado has been down there, USDA is there on a regular basis. Wisconsin has a trade mission planned, I think in December. Um, so, making sure that we have those business relations to just remove some of the regulatory barriers. Because like an example of one of the barriers that we had where, we could grow the flies, but we couldn't actually use the airstrips for the USDA planes because of some regulatory issues between Mexico and the United States. And it happens. We do that to them as well, or border closures and things like that. So thinking about that for just the logistics of getting the right flies to the right area, and making sure the females can find them and they like them. The next one would be like, well, how do we know where these flies are to know where to dump the irradiated flies to try and get rid of them? And there's a lot of lures and traps out there. What we're hearing from Texas is really excited about traps and trying to control bugs in that way outside of sterile flies or in collaboration with. So those traps and flies and lures to make sure we know where they are and to see if we could diminish that population there too. So that's another big strategy and just following the data. And that's been kind of hard following data, because whenever we control an infectious disease, whether it's this New World screwworm, H5N1, BVD, you name it, foot and mouth disease, disease control really has three stools. When you think about that stool, if you're milking a cow, right? One is there's the science, following the science and the data, and that's easy, right? The data doesn't really care about politics; it's going to do whatever it wants, and that's the true raw data. But then there's the economics of it, of what do we do to maintain the business continuity and trade, and then there's the politics, right? And all of those three things need to be working together in order to get really effective movement forward. And as you know, the news cycle or all these different economic variables go into how do we actually make these decisions. So that's really what we're talking about with making sure the governments can talk to each other. We're preparing. In the Nuln labs, there's 64 Nuln labs. There's 5 activated for our New World screwworm right now, and we all have training to identify and send samples to our National Vet Services labs or our active labs. Most of those active labs are going to be south of us. We're not active right now because we just don't really need to be. And collaborating with those labs or our state wildlife and USDA Wildlife Services. USDA Wildlife Services has had some issues with funding with the DOGE issues or early retirement and government funding cutbacks, but we'll still maintain those connections and continue to grow them as much as we can. We talked about emergency use authorization of drugs with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. Food and Drug gets worried because we're making food, and then it's kind of weird. We don't really think about EPA, but anytime you put a topical parasite or a topical drug on an animal for an insecticide or a pesticide, that's actually the purview of the EPA. So we need to make sure that we can use drugs, and if we're going to use drugs off label or new experimental drugs, that we're maintaining our environmental and public health as well as our animal health. We talked about eradicating screwworm with the rearing of sterile flies, and then the fifth way so we talked about those are the 4 points, and then our fifth point is really got to find something new, because what got us here isn't going to get us there. Just because it took decades of sterile fly dropping through United States, Mexico, Latin America to get it into South America, but that may not be. We don't really have decades, right? And things move faster. So we really need to think about what other ways can we fight this fly. And that's kind of the vague part. We don't really know specific details, but there's a lot of different things that we could be looking for to expedite this process to protect our animal health industries. And some of the other politics, we talked about some of the other like regional regulatory things like trade or movement of animals across the border, which there's been in the news a lot with Argentina and National Cattlemen's. But those are other controls that we can do. But it's, flies don't carry passports, so they're going to come through not only with just flying over, or they could come through with people, or on the traffic that crosses the border every day, because we have commerce every day that's moving across, whether it's to build cars, make food, or just with people.
I think one of the important things that you mentioned is, the last time this took decades, and what we're at and what we're talking about right now is the beginning. We aren't towards the end. We're at the start of this thing, and that it's going to take time, and that's part of the big reason for having this discussion is to build the awareness, because whether people like it or not, it's going to be something that we'll be hearing about for a while and might, have an impact. Um, Within that, I know this is another crystal ball vague question, you know, and really a mythical one that, if you could put a timeline on it, when do they think that it will make its way into the southern portion of the US in terms of it becoming more of an issue? Is there any timeline in which they're looking, or is it well, we don't have it here quite yet in terms of our animals seeing it in the cattle side of things, but it could be any day or it could be months from now.
Yeah. When we were talking about other like leukosis virus on the signal in July, many people on the ground were expecting it in September or October. Is it possible that the flies have been there? Yeah, sure. But we haven't reported it yet. So it wouldn't surprise me at any time if we saw it. I'm really hoping that the increased awareness, if we do, and I think we probably will at any time, and maybe when it gets better fly weather, right, when it gets warmer again, they may see more flies move forth in the spring. So if we don't see it now, we could see it in the spring any day. It really wouldn't surprise me. So it's challenging to kind of predict that, but I think the important message is, even if it were here tomorrow, or maybe it was here in May of next year, if you're not hearing anything, that's not because nothing is happening. And there's a lot of work going into making sure, or to be able to respond as quickly as possible. And because the consequence of missing it is very, very high. It's easier to control it early versus later. So I think a lot of this, the important part, it'd be great if there were some legislators listening in on the PDP signal today, but don't stop funding for this. Because the consequence to this fly coming and being endemic in our population would be humongous, comparatively speaking to what we are spending now to prevent it. And it's really easy when it's out of sight, out of mind, to take that money and put it into a different program, which that new program is probably just as important. But we've learned this lesson, and if we're going to change things, we need to be cognizant of what those risks are. We also can't forget that we're dealing with four immediate threats to animal agriculture right now. We have H5N1 in the country and globally from our migratory birds, and we still see endemic infection in several states in the Southwest. States like Wisconsin, we're still doing our surveillance testing to make sure we don't have it. Foot and mouth disease is active. I was in Africa and the Middle East last week and saw multiple foot and mouth disease outbreaks. And we saw foot and mouth in Europe this year. We were able to contain it, but they don't move animals like we do. And then African swine fever still on the island of Hispaniola and likely Cuba, in just off the coast of Florida. So those are big deals that we're working with right now. And when screwworm is taking, or influenza is taking a lot of our resources for poultry or cattle, screwworm coming in, we don't have infinite resources. So that's why it's really important to make sure we're spending this money well and it's effective, and we're following the data, to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with those limited funds.
I think that's a really important note, and I appreciate you mentioning that, because this isn't the only thing going on. It might be getting buzz and it might be getting some news media, but like you mentioned, there is a lot that happens within animal health that ultimately impacts what we do as producers. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And before we kind of, start to wrap up here, I want to think about and ask you this question of we've talked about a lot of the different areas of, if you're a producer in, Wisconsin, Midwest, in this area, it might not be something that is an immediate threat today, but it is something that is potentially going to have an impact in the future here. So when we're thinking about this, why as an industry, why as a whole, as all of us involved in agriculture, do we really need to take not only this seriously, but when we have, these infectious diseases, why is it important that we are aware and taking it seriously, and communicating with our veterinarians when necessary on bigger topics like this?
Yeah, so we have a in animal industry, whether just like any of our industries that are very super efficient. We move animals around, and in the early part of the 20th century, up into the mid-century around World War II, we were losing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in today's money in the beef industry because it creates a serious loss in that industry. It also, we have to think about infectious diseases that could impact our trade. The United States animal agriculture, along with crop agriculture, we're poised to feed the world as demographics change, and that's an awesome responsibility to have, but we can do it. But we have to make sure that we're producing secure, safe food. But that's really our role, I think, in the next 50 years. We also need to think about it as a partial risk budget, right? You can be insurance poor. We can't spend unlimited amounts of money on everything, right? It's just like on the farm, you may or may not have all of your crops insured, because you can be insurance poor there, and you're taking that risk. I think for infectious diseases, a lot of people, if it's out of sight, out of mind, we kind of wait for the barn to be on fire because our level of awareness or our to-do list, our immediate need to get through tomorrow is fixing this electrical issue, or our immediate need is making sure that our somatic cell count is as low as possible. And I think really then what do you do about things that, well, it could happen, the risk is low, is really maintaining those conversations with your veterinarian. We don't want to wait for diseases to become prohibitively expensive to eradicate or control, especially when we know that they're coming or they're changing. And how can we innovatively manage that? A lot of people don't want to hear this, but that really does start with having USDA that's funded and staffed. Right now, we are 25% down in veterinarians. We're close to 1,000 veterinarians in the USDA, where we really should be closer to 2,500. And we always want to be effective in our federal taxpayer dollars, considering deficits or budget shortfalls. But in order to prevent this, it's a lot cheaper to have enough veterinarians and support staff to prevent it versus waiting for it to become a problem and then dealing with the barn that's on fire. So, we've seen this drastic or this continual reduction in funds and veterinarians, that we're not doing enough inspections in our food inspection service that's been deficient of veterinary inspectors for decades now. And now just in 2025, we lost another 25%. 5 years ago, John Clifford, the chief veterinary officer at the time, said we really should be at 24 to 2,500 veterinarians to be able to manage all of the different things that we're seeing in an effective way. And that's not it's not an over budget or like a fat budget to kind of like, hey, let's just get more people. That was really to manage threats like African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, or any new pathogens coming up. At that time, no one was talking about New World screwworm except for in the key deer in Florida. So, and now, we had 1,800 at the time, and now we're closer to 1,000. So that's just efficient. And that's what USDA is for. It's a huge agency, it's a huge bureaucracy, but we can do better. Those positions are still there, they're just not filled. But in order to protect our industry in general, USDA is really the kind of the mothership. They're the umbrella that really provides the guidance and the research to be able to do so. Like the Dairy Hub in Wisconsin, producers understand how important that Dairy Innovation Hub is. That's bipartisanly supported to keep dairy moving forward, to stay on the front edge of that curve, because dairy today is not going to be how we dairy profitably 5 years from now. So, but that starts with people. And I'll always advocate for trying to get people into USDA, but they need to have a stable job. They don't get paid as much, but they need to have a stable job and funding, and they need to be supported by our industry and our political kind of machine around the world. So that's really where we go, is about making sure that we really do invest into these programs. And gosh, we might have some positive side effects along the way, like finding better ways to manage other diseases like BVD or salmonellosis, or really making sure we are able to keep foot and mouth disease out of this country, or whatever that new disease is coming in, be it a coronavirus or an African swine fever, or some of the other viruses or bacteria that we see in different continents around the world.
I think, Dr. Paulson, that is a really great way of thinking about things that as we, get towards a wrap up, is that it's not just animals, it's the people. It's, it's a much bigger piece of the puzzle than just one, more than one fly, but one thing that's happening. There's a lot that goes on. There's a lot of puzzle pieces that have to fit together. But in order to do that, it requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of work, as well as having the right people in the right place to make sure that we, as dairy producers, keep having the opportunity to do what we love. With all of that being said, we've had a lot of good discussion, but when thinking about screwworm and what's going on, what do you want producers to really be thinking about or actively doing after today's discussion?
First, talk to your vet, right? Talk to your veterinarian, maybe in your cooperative. If you need, there are lots of people out there that can provide a talk or answer questions in real time. We're more than happy to do that at WVDL or at the School of Veterinary Medicine, or maybe your veterinary service, let's say United Vet or Dairy Doctors or Lodi Veterinary Care. Maybe that they can host a speaker and producers can learn more about it. You can go to the USDA's website. They have lots of different recorded talks about this. And then really it's about stay informed. Right? Think about it. Podcasts like this. If we're to see a problem, I'm sure we would be right back at it. Hey, remember what we talked about on November 20th before Thanksgiving? Let's go back to that and know, okay, now what do we do, right? So having proactive education out there just to make sure it stays on your mind. It might not be quite as important as dealing with a current calf problem right now. But if it changes, we certainly keep your eyes and ears open and ask questions. And I wouldn't necessarily wait for the government to tell you. Talk to your veterinarian, right? Because you want to know exactly how this affects you. The government and USDA and DACAP, or I'm limited to Wisconsin here. I know we have listeners from all over, but the messaging that they're going to have is going to be really more blanket and broad, which really then may or may not help one individual producer in a very specific region, where maybe you don't bring animals in, or maybe you do. So that's when you take that blanket information that is released and then talk to your vet about it. And then if we need to go further from there, the WVMA, the Veterinary Medical Associations, PDP, Farm Bureau, Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin, they're really going to start getting that message out, because that's what we do to support the industry.
Well, Dr. Paulson, thank you so much again for your time here this afternoon and really breaking down what is going on, what has happened, and why we should be paying attention to something like the New World screwworm, especially as it, creeps towards the U.S. side here. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Amber. I always appreciate coming on the signal and hope you have a good Thanksgiving.
Well, you as well. And I also have to say to those who are potentially in Wisconsin and headed out to the woods this weekend for deer opener, I wish you the best of luck, and stay safe as well. I know there's many other states who have already had it or are still looking forward to getting out in the woods here this fall as well. I also have to say that if you are listening and you're wondering what is going on in the world of professional dairy producers, head over to our website at pdpw.org to learn more. We have a lot of really great programs coming up, including Dairy Insight Summit here at the beginning of December. Dairy Managers Institute, it'll be in Green Bay this year. That's the middle portion of December. And we're also looking forward to heading towards Puerto Rico. So nice warm climate in January for our Dairy Managers Academy. So if any of those sound a little bit enticing to you or looking for what else is out there, head over to our website to learn more. And then one more time, a huge thank you to our current partner of the Dairy Signal, which is Zimpro. With all of that being said, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you here next week on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.